I'm Sergeant Sandy Hammond, 29 years old, and I survived an ambush in Kandahar that left me with shrapnel scars and a Purple Heart. For years, I carried my family on my back, paying bills, covering mistakes, and still showing up in uniform when they mocked my service. But when I stood to receive that medal and my own father sneered, "She got lucky, not brave," the truth came out. They'd sold intel to the very people who tried to kill me. Have you ever been betrayed by the ones you gave everything to? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to set boundaries after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about reclaiming your worth. What happened after that moment might surprise you. I stood in my dress uniform, the fabric crisp against my skin, waiting for my name to be called. The ceremony hall buzzed with quiet conversations and the rustle of programs, but I could feel eyes on me from the family section. Not the proud, beaming looks you'd expect at a Purple Heart ceremony. These were different. Calculating. Cold. My father sat in the third row, arms crossed, that familiar expression of skepticism etched into his weathered face. He'd worn it my entire life. When I made honor roll, when I graduated boot camp, when I earned my first commendation. Nothing I did ever seemed to measure up to whatever standard he'd set in his mind. Today should have been different. Today, I was receiving recognition for surviving an ambush in Kandahar that killed 3 of my squad mates and left me with shrapnel scars and a traumatic brain injury that still gave me headaches. But there he sat, shaking his head slightly at something my brother whispered in his ear. Tristan had that smirk he'd perfected in high school, the one that said he knew something you didn't. Next to him, my sister Mia scrolled through her phone, occasionally glancing up with barely concealed annoyance. Mom sat rigid, her purse clutched in her lap like armor, her face a mask of polite endurance. The uniformed officers around me radiated quiet pride and respect. These were my people now, had been for 8 years. They understood what the purple ribbon and bronze star meant, what it cost to earn them. But my family? They treated this ceremony like an obligation, something to be endured rather than celebrated. I thought back to the phone call I'd made to tell them about the honor. Dad's response had been typical. "Well, I suppose that's something." Not congratulations. Not pride. Just grudging acknowledgement that something had happened. Tristan had laughed outright. Purple Heart for what? Getting hurt? They give those out like candy now. Mia had been more direct. "Do we really have to come to this? I've got plans that weekend." Only Mom had shown any enthusiasm, but even hers felt forced. "Of course we'll be there, honey. We're so proud." But I'd heard the conversation continue in the background after she thought she'd hung up. Proud of what? She chose to go over there. What did she expect would happen? The comments had stung, but they weren't new. For years, my family had treated my military service as an inconvenience at best, a betrayal at worst. When I'd enlisted straight out of high school, Dad had called it running away from responsibility. When I'd turned down college to pursue my military career, he'd said I was wasting my potential. When I deployed to Afghanistan, Mia had complained that I was abandoning the family right when they needed me most. That need always seemed to center around money. Despite their constant criticism of my choices, they'd never hesitated to ask for help when times got tough. Car payments, rent, unexpected expenses, somehow these always became my responsibility. I'd sent thousands home over the years, money that could have gone toward my own future, my own goals. But family was family, and loyalty ran deep, even when it wasn't reciprocated. The pattern was so established I'd stopped questioning it. They criticized, I provided. They dismissed my achievements, I tried harder to earn their approval. They treated my service as selfishness, I sent larger checks to prove my devotion. It was a dance we'd been performing for so long that I'd forgotten there might be other steps. But sitting in that ceremony hall, watching my father check his watch and my brother roll his eyes at the opening remarks, something shifted. This wasn't just indifference. This was active disdain. They weren't just unimpressed by my service, they resented it. Resented me for it. The general stepped to the podium, his voice carrying easily through the hall. He spoke about sacrifice, about courage under fire, about the price of freedom. Standard ceremony language, but delivered with the gravitas of someone who understood its weight. As he spoke, I caught my family exchanging looks, not the knowing glances of shared pride, but something else. Something that made my stomach tighten with unease. When my name was finally called, I stepped forward on unsteady legs. The applause was warm, respectful, but I barely heard it over the blood rushing in my ears. This moment had taken 2 years to arrive. 2 years of medical evaluations, paperwork, bureaucratic delays. 2 years of healing, physically and mentally, from what had happened in that dusty street in Kandahar. I'd imagined this moment countless times. In my fantasies, my family finally understood. Finally saw that my service meant something, that I wasn't the disappointment they'd painted me as. I'd pictured Dad's face softening with pride, Mom wiping away tears, my siblings looking at me with new respect. Instead, as I approached the general, I heard my father's voice cut through the ceremonial quiet. She got lucky, not brave. The words hit like a physical blow. Lucky, not brave. After everything I'd survived, everything I'd endured, he reduced it to luck. The officer next to me heard it too. I saw his jaw tighten, his eyes narrow as he located the source of the comment. Other attendees shifted uncomfortably, the inappropriate nature of the outburst rippling through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. But it was the general's reaction that truly unnerved me. He didn't just pause in his prepared remarks. He stopped completely, his eyes moving from my father to me and back again. There was something in his expression, a recognition that went beyond mere disapproval of the interruption. He looked like a man who'd just had a suspicion confirmed. The ceremony continued, but the moment had been poisoned. What should have been the culmination of my military recognition felt tainted, overshadowed by my family's public dismissal. As the general pinned the medal to my uniform, I felt the weight of it differently than I'd expected. Not as an honor, but as evidence of a divide that might be too wide to bridge. The applause came again, but all I could think about was the look in the general's eyes and the certainty that this ceremony was about to become something entirely different from what any of us had expected. The general's hands were steady as he pinned the purple heart to my uniform, but when he looked up at me, there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there moments before. Not just the formal respect due a wounded warrior, but something sharper. More personal. "Congratulations, Sergeant," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. But he didn't step back. Instead, he turned to address the audience, his gaze sweeping across the seated attendees before settling on my family's section. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone shifting from ceremonial to something more grave. "Today we honor not just courage in combat, but survival against overwhelming odds." I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't part of the standard script. The general reached into his jacket and withdrew a manila folder, the kind used for classified materials. The sight of it made my mouth go dry. "The ambush that wounded Sergeant Hammond wasn't random," he continued, his words cutting through the hall like a blade. "Our intelligence was compromised. Information about troop movements, patrol routes, and operational timing was leaked to enemy forces." The silence in the room was absolute. Even my father had stopped fidgeting. I could see color draining from my mother's face, Mia's phone forgotten in her lap, Tristan's suddenly very still. The general opened the folder, his eyes scanning the contents before looking directly at my family. "The leak came through her family." The words hit the room like a grenade. Gasps erupted from the audience. Officers turned to stare at the suddenly pale figures in the third row. I felt the world tilt beneath my feet, my carefully controlled composure threatening to shatter completely. "That's impossible," Dad said, his voice cracking as he half rose from his seat. "We would never. Phone records, Mr. Hammond. Email communications. Financial transactions." The general's voice was ice-cold professional, each word precisely delivered. "The investigation has been ongoing for 18 months. Your conversations with individuals later identified as foreign intelligence operatives. Information shared about your daughter's deployment, her unit's location, their operational schedule." Mom was shaking her head frantically. "We didn't know. We had no idea who those people were. They said they were journalists, researchers. They paid you. the general stated flatly. Substantial sums. Money that coincidentally arrived just before each request for information about your daughter's activities overseas. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The sudden improvement in their financial situation during my deployment. Dad's new truck. The vacation they'd taken while I was getting shot at in Kandahar. Mia's student loans mysteriously paid off. Tristan's down payment on his condo. All of it funded by intelligence sold about me. About my unit. About operations that got my friends killed. We thought it was harmless, Tristan said, his usual smirk replaced by naked panic. Just general information. Nothing specific. Nothing specific? The general's voice rose slightly, the first crack in his professional demeanor. Patrol routes are harmless? Vehicle assignments? Base security protocols. I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. The ambush. They knew we were coming. The general nodded grimly. They knew your route, your timing, your vehicle positions. They knew because your family provided detailed information about your unit's operations in exchange for money. The hall buzzed with shocked murmurs. I could feel the eyes of my fellow service members on me, some filled with sympathy, others with the kind of suspicion that would follow me for years. The daughter of traitors. The soldier whose own family sold her out. This is insane, Mia said, her voice shrill. We're not spies. We're not terrorists. We needed the money. You needed the money, I repeated, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. So you sold information that got soldiers killed. We didn't know. Mom was crying now, mascara streaming down her cheeks. They told us it was for academic research, for understanding military families. They never said it would be used against you. The general closed the folder with a sharp snap. Ignorance is not a defense for treason, Mrs. Hammond. Your family accepted payment from foreign operatives in exchange for classified information about American military operations. 3 soldiers died in that ambush. Your daughter survived by luck and training, not because of any consideration on your part. Dad had sunk back into his seat, his face gray. The man who'd spent my entire life questioning my choices, dismissing my achievements, had just been exposed as the reason I'd nearly died. The reason my squad leader would never go home to his wife and kids. The reason our medic would never finish the veterinary degree he'd been working on between deployments. The ceremony will continue, the general announced to the room. Sergeant Hammond earned this honor through her service and sacrifice. The fact that her sacrifice was made necessary by her family's betrayal only makes her survival more remarkable. He turned back to me, his expression softening slightly. Your Purple Heart represents not just wounds received in combat, but your survival despite being sold out by those who should have protected you. That makes you not just brave, Sergeant. It makes you extraordinary. The applause that followed was different now. Not just respectful, but protective. My fellow service members understood what this revelation meant, how it would change everything about my relationship with my family, my sense of trust, my understanding of loyalty itself. As the ceremony concluded and people began to file out, my family sat frozen in their seats. The weight of what they'd done, what they'd caused, settling over them like a shroud. They'd wanted to diminish my service, to reduce my sacrifice to luck. Instead, they'd revealed themselves as the reason sacrifice was necessary at all. Growing up, I was the responsible one. While Tristan spent his teenage years getting suspended from school and Mia bounced between boyfriends and part-time jobs, I kept my grades up, worked summers to save money for college, and helped Mom manage the household when Dad's drinking got bad. It wasn't a role I chose so much as one that fell to me by default. Dad worked construction when the jobs were available, which wasn't as often as the bills required. Mom cleaned houses for wealthy families across town, coming home exhausted and resentful, her hands cracked from chemicals and her back aching from bending over other people's messes. We weren't poor exactly, but we lived paycheck to paycheck, always one emergency away from crisis. I learned early that stability was something you created for yourself. While my siblings coasted on charm and excuses, I built structure. Morning runs before school. Homework completed before dinner. A part-time job at the local hardware store that taught me the value of showing up on time and following through on commitments. The military appealed to me because it promised more of that structure, that reliability I craved. Dad's reaction to my enlistment revealed the fault line that would define our relationship for years to come. He'd pushed me to be tough my entire childhood, teaching me to change oil, handle tools, stand up for myself. But when I channeled that toughness into military service, he saw it as rejection rather than evolution. "You think you're better than us now," he'd said the night I signed my papers. "Too good for construction work? Too good for the family business." There was no family business. Just Dad picking up jobs when his reputation hadn't caught up with him yet, when contractors didn't know about his tendency to disappear for 3-day benders or show up to work sites hungover and argumentative. But pointing that out would have meant acknowledging truths we all worked hard to avoid. Mom's response was more complicated. Pride mixed with worry, support tangled with guilt. "I just want you to be safe," she'd said, smoothing my hair the way she had when I was small. "The world's dangerous enough without going looking for trouble." But even her concern felt conditional. When my first paycheck allowed me to contribute to household expenses, her worry about my safety became secondary to appreciation for my contribution. When my military housing allowance meant I could help with Tristan's car payment, her questions about my well-being became requests for financial assistance. The pattern established itself quickly. I'd call home from basic training, and within minutes the conversation would shift from how I was doing to what bills needed paying. I'd mention my upcoming deployment, and Dad would ask if my life insurance was up to date, not from paternal concern, but because he'd calculated the payout amount. My siblings treated my service as an extended vacation funded by taxpayer money. Tristan would joke about me playing soldier while he worked real jobs, though his employment history was sporadic at best. Mia saw my deployment as abandonment, complaining that I was running away just when she needed help with babysitting or rent money. The irony wasn't lost on me. The family that criticized my choices had become financially dependent on them. My steady military income subsidized Dad's irregular construction work, covered Mia's college expenses when her grants fell short, and bailed Tristan out of the consequences of his poor decisions with predictable regularity. But I kept sending money because that's what family did. That's what responsibility looked like. Even when Dad's criticism stung, even when Mia's demands felt endless, even when Tristan's gratitude lasted exactly as long as it took him to spend what I'd sent. The dependency worked both ways. I needed their approval as much as they needed my financial support. Each check I sent was an argument for my worth, evidence that my choices had value even if they couldn't see it. I thought if I proved myself useful enough, generous enough, they'd eventually understand that my service was service to them too. During my first deployment to Afghanistan, the calls home became lifelines to a world that felt increasingly distant. But even those conversations carried the familiar weight of expectation. Dad would ask about hazard pay rates. Mom would mention overdue bills. Mia would hint about her latest crisis requiring immediate financial intervention. I'd hang up those calls feeling more isolated than when I'd started them. My squad mates became my real family during that deployment, people who understood the weight of responsibility, who shared the burden of keeping each other safe. They didn't need me to prove my worth through bank transfers. My value to them was measured in competence, reliability, loyalty. But loyalty to your blood runs deeper than logic. Even when I recognized the pattern, even when I saw how one-sided the relationship had become, I couldn't break free from it. They were my family. Family meant sacrifice. It meant putting their needs before your own, their security before your comfort. I told myself their criticism came from love, from worry about dangers they couldn't understand. I convinced myself that their financial dependence was temporary, that eventually they'd stabilize and the relationship would balance out. I believed that my service, my sacrifice, would eventually earn the respect I'd been chasing since childhood. The Purple Heart ceremony was supposed to be the moment that happened. The moment they finally saw that my choices had meaning, that my service had value beyond the checks I sent home. I'd pictured Dad's face when the general described what I'd survived, how I'd earned this recognition. Instead, I learned that the same family I'd been supporting had been selling information about my service to people who wanted me dead. The aftermath of the general's revelation felt like living inside a fishbowl. Every conversation stopped when I entered a room. Fellow officers offered carefully worded condolences that felt more like sympathy for a terminal diagnosis. The investigation that followed consumed weeks of my life. Interviews, polygraph tests, security clearance reviews that would determine whether I had a future in the military at all. But none of that compared to the replaying loop in my head of that morning in Kandahar when everything went wrong. We'd been 3 vehicles deep into what should have been a routine patrol. I was riding in the second Humvee, running comms with our forward observers, when the world exploded around us. The IED took out our lead vehicle completely. Jackson, Martinez, and Crawford gone in an instant. The secondary devices caught our truck and the one behind us in a crossfire of shrapnel and automatic weapons fire. What I remembered most clearly wasn't the pain or the chaos, but the precision of it. How perfectly positioned the ambush was. How they'd known exactly where to place the charges for maximum damage. How the timing of the secondary attack suggested they'd known our exact route, our speed, even our radio protocols. At the time, we'd attributed it to bad luck and enemy competence. Taliban forces had gotten better at predicting American tactics, we told ourselves. They'd learned from previous engagements, adapted their strategies. The alternative, that someone on our side had fed them information, was too terrible to seriously consider. Now I knew the truth. My own family had provided the intelligence that killed my friends and nearly killed me. The money they'd collected for betraying American operations had paid for Dad's truck, Mia's education, Tristan's down payment. Blood money, literally. The investigation revealed the full scope of their cooperation. Phone calls with people claiming to be researchers studying military families. Email exchanges providing details about deployment schedules, base locations, operational security procedures. Bank deposits that corresponded precisely with each information transfer. The amounts were staggering. Over 2 years, they'd collected nearly $100,000 for what they claimed to believe was academic research. $100,000 for selling out their own daughter and every soldier who served alongside her. We thought it was harmless, Mom kept repeating during the family meeting the military investigators insisted on. They said they were writing papers about military families, about how deployment affects relationships. What papers? The lead investigator asked. Can you show us any published research that resulted from this information? Of course they couldn't. Because there were no papers. No research. Just intelligence gathering that had gotten soldiers killed and nearly gotten me killed too. Dad sat silent through most of the meeting, his earlier bluster replaced by the kind of hollow-eyed shock that comes with facing consequences you never thought would arrive. When pressed about his motivations, his answers were pathetically predictable. The money was good, he admitted. Regular. More than I was making in construction. They said it was legal, that they had government approval for their research. Government approval, the investigator repeated flatly. From which agency? They said it was classified. That they couldn't provide documentation because of security protocols. Even recounting it, Dad seemed to understand how ridiculous it sounded. Foreign operatives claiming government approval for classified research they couldn't document, paying substantial sums for information about American military operations. It was the kind of obvious scam that should have triggered every red flag, except greed had made them stupid. Mia's justification was even more infuriating. We needed the money, she said, as if that explained everything. Do you know how expensive college is? How much student loans cost? You were overseas making good money, and we were struggling here. I was overseas getting shot at, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. By people using information you provided. We didn't know that, she snapped back. How were we supposed to know what they were really doing with it? That was the heart of it. They'd chosen not to know. Chosen not to ask the obvious questions because the money was too good and the need too great. They'd sold out their own daughter, their own country, because it was easier than finding legitimate solutions to their problems. Tristan tried a different approach, one that cut even deeper than Mia's selfishness or Dad's greed. You were never really part of this family anyway, he said during one particularly heated exchange. Always thought you were better than us, always judging us. Maybe this just proves what we all already knew. The accusation was designed to wound, and it succeeded. because part of me had always felt separate from them, different in ways that went beyond career choices or life philosophy. Their willingness to betray me hadn't just endangered my life, it had confirmed that the distance I'd always felt was real, justified, permanent. But understanding their motivations didn't make the betrayal hurt less. These were the people who'd raised me, who I'd supported through every crisis, who I'd loved despite their flaws and failures. The discovery that they'd valued money more than my life, more than the lives of my fellow soldiers, more than basic loyalty to their own country, shattered something fundamental in how I understood family, trust, and love. The ceremony had been meant to honor my survival and sacrifice. Instead, it had revealed that both had been necessary because of the people who should have been protecting me. The decision formed slowly, like ice crystallizing on still water. For days after the revelation, I existed in a strange limbo where old habits warred with new understanding. My phone would ring with Mom's number, and I'd feel the familiar pull to answer, to reassure, to problem-solve whatever crisis she was calling about. Then I'd remember that her last crisis had been funded by selling information that nearly got me killed. The first test came 2 weeks after the ceremony. Mia called, her voice thick with tears, explaining that she needed money for rent or she'd be evicted. The old me would have asked how much and promised to wire it by morning. The new me, the one who knew my family had traded my life for cash, listened to her explanation and felt nothing but cold clarity. "I can't help you," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "What do you mean you can't help me? You always help." "That's what family does. Family doesn't sell intelligence about each other to foreign operatives." "That's not fair," she said, her tears shifting to anger with familiar speed. "We made a mistake. We're sorry. But you can't just abandon us because of one error in judgment." One error in judgment. As if betraying their country and endangering their daughter was equivalent to bouncing a check or missing an appointment. As if 2 years of systematic intelligence gathering could be dismissed as a simple mistake. "The money's gone," I told her. "All of it. No more rent payments, no more crisis intervention, no more bailing anyone out of the consequences of their choices." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a venom I'd never heard directed at me before. "You're really going to punish all of us forever because of this? You're going to let me become homeless over something we didn't even understand. You understood enough to cash the checks. God, you've become cold. The military really did change you, didn't it? Turned you into someone who can abandon family when they need you most." I ended the call without responding. Let her think the military had changed me. Let her blame my service for my unwillingness to keep funding her life while she justified selling out mine. The truth was simpler and more painful. I'd finally stopped pretending that obligation was the same thing as love. Tristan tried a different approach, showing up at my apartment unannounced with a six-pack and his most charming smile. The same combination that had worked countless times before, usually when he needed money for car repairs or child support payments. "Come on, sis," he said, settling onto my couch like he belonged there. "We need to talk about this family situation. Get past all the drama and back to normal." "Normal," I repeated. "You mean back to me sending money while you mock my service?" "That was just joking around. You know I didn't mean anything by it. We all support what you do, even if we don't always understand it." "Support?" I pulled 2 beers from the six-pack he'd bought with money I'd sent him 3 months ago, and handed him one. "Is that what you call it when you give my patrol schedules to foreign intelligence services?" His face flushed. "We didn't know what they were doing with that information. They said it was for research about military families. We thought we were helping." "Helping who?" "Not me. Not the soldiers who died because you provided intelligence to the people trying to kill us." "Look," he said, leaning forward with the earnest expression he'd perfected for getting out of trouble, "we effed up. I admit that. But we're family. Family forgives each other. Family moves forward together. Family protects each other," I said. "Family doesn't sell each other out for money." He took a long drink before responding. "The money helped everyone. Including you. You think we didn't use some of it to help with things you needed? Car insurance when you were deployed? Storage fees for your stuff? We were all in it together." The gaslighting was breathtaking in its audacity. He wanted me to believe that betraying me had somehow been for my benefit, that I should be grateful for being sold out because some of the money had indirectly benefited me. "Get out," I said quietly. "Come on, don't be like this. We can work through this if you'll just get out of my apartment now." He left, but not before making sure I understood that I was the one breaking up the family, that my unwillingness to forgive made me the villain in this story. It was a masterclass in manipulation, the kind of emotional terrorism that had kept me compliant for years. Dad's approach was more direct and, in some ways, more honest. He called me once, 3 weeks after the ceremony, and delivered his message without preamble. "You're destroying this family," he said. "Your mother cries every day. Mia might lose her apartment. Tristan is talking about leaving town because he can't afford to stay. All because you won't forgive one mistake. One mistake that got soldiers killed. Soldiers die in wars. That's what they sign up for. But families are supposed to last forever." The casual dismissal of military sacrifice, the reduction of my friends' deaths to inevitable casualties, the demand that I prioritize family loyalty over justice or even basic self-preservation. It crystallized everything wrong with our relationship in one ugly moment. "This family ended when you decided money was more important than my life," I told him. "Don't be dramatic. You survived. You're fine. But if you keep this up, you're going to lose the only people who will ever really love you." I hung up on him. But his words lingered because they touched the fear that had kept me trapped in their dysfunction for so long, the fear that without them, I'd have no one. That conditional love was better than no love at all. It took time to recognize that fear as another form of manipulation, another chain keeping me bound to people who'd proven they valued me only for what I could provide. The investigation moved with military precision, each revelation more damaging than the last. Financial records showed the pattern clearly. Information requests followed by payment, deployment schedules followed by wire transfers, operational details followed by cash deposits. My family had been more thorough in their betrayal than even they seemed to realize. Phone logs revealed calls at all hours, sometimes daily communication with their handlers. Email archives showed detailed intelligence about base security procedures, personnel rotations, even the psychological profiles of soldiers in my unit. They'd provided everything: names, addresses, family information, deployment schedules, personal habits, operational vulnerabilities. The investigators painted a picture of systematic intelligence gathering that went far beyond what my family claimed to understand. This wasn't casual conversation with researchers. This was professional-level espionage conducted by people who'd convinced themselves they were just answering harmless questions for easy money. Dad's construction business became a cover story. His sporadic employment wasn't due to a struggling economy or industry downturns. It was because he was making more money selling military intelligence than he could ever earn building houses. The foreign operatives had become his primary employers, providing steady income in exchange for information about his daughter's military service. Mom's house-cleaning clients included several wives of military contractors and Defense Department employees. The investigators suspected she'd been tasked with gathering information from those homes: family photos, documents left on desks, overheard phone conversations. Her innocent questions about their husband's work suddenly looked like intelligence gathering rather than friendly interest. Mia's college funding came entirely from the espionage payments. Her tuition, housing, books, even her spring break trips were funded by selling out American soldiers. When confronted with this timeline, she broke down completely, finally understanding that her entire adult life had been built on blood money. Tristan's business ventures, the failed restaurant, the abandoned consulting company, the series of get-rich-quick schemes, had all been subsidized by the intelligence payments. His lifestyle, his apartment, his car, even his child support payments were connected to the betrayal. He'd been living off the sale of information that got soldiers killed. The scope of the operation explained why the ambush in Kandahar had been so precisely executed. The enemy had known not just our route and timing, but our radio frequencies, our standard operating procedures, even the personal habits of individual soldiers. They'd known that Jackson always rode in the lead vehicle. They'd known that Martinez carried extra medical supplies. They'd known that Crawford had a habit of checking his equipment obsessively before missions. They'd known because my family had told them. The revelation devastated our unit's survivors. These were men and women who'd trusted each other with their lives, who'd believed that operational security was sacred. Learning that one of their own had been compromised by her own family shattered something fundamental about military brotherhood, about the idea that some bonds were unbreakable. Some handled it better than others. Thompson, our squad leader, pulled me aside after one particularly brutal interview session. "This isn't on you," he said simply. "You didn't choose your family. You didn't control their actions. You survived because you're a good soldier, not because they're bad people." But others struggled with the implications. If my family could be turned, if blood loyalty could be purchased, what did that say about the security of other operations? How many other families might be feeding information to enemy forces? How many other soldiers might be compromised without knowing it? The investigation expanded, examining the families of other soldiers who'd been involved in compromised operations. The results were sobering. My family wasn't unique. Across the military, enemy operatives had successfully recruited family members through a combination of financial pressure, emotional manipulation, and willful ignorance about the consequences of their cooperation. The pattern was depressingly consistent. Struggling families contacted by people claiming to be researchers or journalists offered money for seemingly harmless information about their military relatives, gradually drawn deeper into intelligence gathering without fully understanding, or wanting to understand, what they were really doing. My family's case became a template for understanding how these recruitment operations worked. The investigators used our story to train other security personnel, to develop protocols for protecting military families from enemy infiltration. My personal tragedy became a case study in how ordinary people could be turned against their own country through greed, desperation, and self-deception. But while the investigation provided answers, it couldn't restore what had been lost. Trust, once broken at this level, doesn't simply heal with time or forgiveness. The people I'd loved most in the world had proven they could be bought, that their loyalty had a price, that my life was worth less to them than financial comfort. The military offered counseling, support groups, resources for dealing with family betrayal in the context of national security. But there's no manual for rebuilding your identity when the people who shaped you turn out to be enemies, no protocol for learning to trust again when your own blood has sold you out. The investigation concluded with arrests, prosecutions, prison sentences for the foreign operatives who'd run the recruitment network. My family members received lighter sentences in exchange for their cooperation with the investigation, community service, probation, financial penalties that would take years to repay. Justice, the investigators said. Accountability. Legal consequences for their actions. But justice couldn't resurrect Jackson, Martinez, or Crawford. Accountability couldn't undo the 2 years of systematic betrayal. Legal consequences couldn't restore the faith I'd lost in family, in loyalty, in the idea that some bonds were sacred. I'd survived the ambush in Kandahar, but the discovery of my family's role in it had wounded me in ways that no enemy bullet ever could. They tried to come back, of course. Family bonds, even poison ones, don't break cleanly. The attempt started small. Birthday cards with carefully neutral messages, Christmas gifts left at my apartment door, invitations to family gatherings delivered through mutual friends. Each overture carried the unspoken assumption that time would heal what had been broken, that eventually I'd miss them enough to overlook what they'd done. Mom's letters were the hardest to ignore. Written in her careful cursive on blue stationery, they arrived monthly like clockwork, each one a masterpiece of selective memory and emotional manipulation. She wrote about family dinners I was missing, about how empty the holidays felt without me, about her health problems and Dad's struggles with unemployment now that his research consulting income had disappeared. "I know we made mistakes," she'd write, "but we never meant to hurt you. We love you more than anything, and we're willing to do whatever it takes to earn your forgiveness. Whatever it takes, except acknowledge the full scope of what they'd done. Whatever it takes, accept that some betrayals are unforgivable. Whatever it takes, accept respect my decision to protect myself from further harm." Mia tried a different approach, showing up at my apartment with her toddler daughter in tow. She'd calculated correctly that using my niece as leverage would be particularly effective, knowing I'd always had a soft spot for children and family connections. "Emma asks about her Aunt Jenny all the time," Mia said, standing in my doorway with the little girl on her hip. "She doesn't understand why you don't come to birthday parties anymore." Emma was 3 years old, with Mia's dark hair and my father's stubborn chin. She looked at me with the uncomplicated love that only children can manage, reaching out her small hands with complete trust that I'd take her. For a moment, the old patterns reasserted themselves. This was my family. These connections mattered. Blue D was thicker than betrayal, wasn't it? But then I remembered that Emma's college fund, her daycare, even her birthday parties were being funded by money Mia had earned selling information that got soldiers killed. The child herself was innocent, but she was also a product of that betrayal, raised on blood money and used now as a tool to manipulate me back into compliance. "She'll understand when she's older," I told Mia, not taking the child, but not closing the door either. "When you explained to her how her mother sold out American soldiers to pay for her lifestyle." Mia's face crumpled. "You can't punish Emma for what I did. She's just a baby." "I'm not punishing her. I'm protecting myself. And maybe protecting her too, from learning that betraying family is acceptable if the price is right." "It wasn't like that," Mia said, but without conviction. The months since the revelation had worn down her ability to maintain the fiction that they'd been innocent victims of sophisticated manipulation. Tristan tried the direct approach, cornering me after a grocery store encounter that felt too coincidental to be accidental. He'd been drinking, his words slightly slurred, but his message clear. "You've gotten everything you wanted," he said, following me to my car despite my obvious attempts to avoid conversation. "You've destroyed the family, made yourself the victim, gotten all the sympathy and attention you always craved. What I wanted was a family that didn't sell me out to enemy forces. We made one mistake. One effing mistake, and you've used it to punish all of us forever. Do you know what it's been like for us? The shame, the isolation, people staring at us everywhere we go. People stare because you're traitors," I said, unlocking my car door. "Because you took money to provide intelligence that got American soldiers killed. Soldiers die in wars," he shouted, loud enough that other shoppers turned to look. "That's what happens in wars. But families are supposed to stick together. Then you should have thought about that before you chose money over family." He grabbed my arm as I tried to get into the car, his grip tight enough to leave bruises. "You self-righteous bitch. You think you're so much better than us, but you're just as effed up as the rest of us. The only difference is you found a way to make your damage pay." I pulled free and got into my car, but his words followed me home. Not because they were true, but because they revealed how completely he'd failed to understand what they'd done. In his mind, my refusal to forgive was the real betrayal. My insistence on boundaries was the true crime. My survival and success were somehow unfair advantages rather than earned achievements. Dad's approach was the most insidious because it played on the relationship that had shaped me most profoundly. He didn't visit or call. Instead, he sent messages through other people, family, friends, distant relatives, people from the neighborhood who remembered me as a child. The message was always the same. He was proud of my service, proud of my strength, but heartbroken that I'd chosen to abandon family over a misunderstanding. He understood my anger, respected my boundaries, but hoped that someday I'd find it in my heart to forgive. It was masterful manipulation, painting himself as the patient, loving father whose only crime was loving his family too much. It positioned me as the unreasonable daughter who couldn't get past a simple mistake. It suggested that my refusal to reconcile was actually a character flaw, a failure of love and forgiveness that diminished me more than it punished them. The most painful part was how effective it was. Despite everything I knew about what they'd done, despite the clear evidence of their betrayal, part of me still craved their approval, still wanted to believe that family bonds could overcome anything. But I'd learned to recognize that craving for what it was, not love, but trauma bonding. The same psychological mechanism that keeps abuse victims tied to their abusers. The belief that if you just try hard enough, sacrifice enough, forgive enough, You can earn the unconditional love that healthy families provide freely. The turning point came during a conversation with my therapist, a former military psychiatrist who specialized in family trauma and betrayal. She'd been working with me for months on understanding the difference between forgiveness and enabling, between healing and returning to harmful patterns. They want you to believe that forgiveness means forgetting, she said during one session. That moving past trauma means pretending it didn't happen. But real healing acknowledges the damage while choosing not to let it define your future. But they're still my family, I said, voicing the conflict that kept me awake at night. They raised me, loved me, supported me in their own way. They sold intelligence about you to enemy forces, she replied gently. Love doesn't do that. Support doesn't do that. Whatever they felt for you, it was conditional on your usefulness to them. The truth was brutal but clarifying. They hadn't loved me, they'd loved what I could provide. They hadn't supported me, they'd supported the income stream I represented. When those things came into conflict with easy money, they'd chosen the money without hesitation. Understanding that didn't make the loss hurt less, but it did make my boundaries clearer. I wasn't abandoning family, I was protecting myself from people who'd proven they couldn't be trusted with my safety, my well-being, or my life. 5 years later, I stood in the same ceremony hall where the truth had been revealed, but this time I was the one delivering the speech. The military had promoted me to lieutenant, then captain, recognizing not just my service record, but my resilience in the face of unprecedented personal betrayal. My survival story had become part of military training protocols, a case study in maintaining operational security even when your own family represents a threat. The audience was different this time, younger officers, fresh faces who'd grown up with social media and different ideas about privacy and loyalty. I looked out at them and saw myself 5 years ago, confident in the unbreakable bonds of family, certain that blood ties meant unconditional support, naive about how easily love could be monetized. Security isn't just about following protocols, I told them, delivering words I'd practiced, but still felt the weight of. It's about understanding that threats can come from anywhere, including places you'd never expect to look. After the speech, a young sergeant approached me, her expression uncertain. Ma'am, can I ask you something personal? I nodded, recognizing the look. I'd seen it dozens of times over the years, soldiers struggling with family pressure, with requests for information that seemed harmless but felt wrong, with the tension between loyalty and security. My mom keeps asking about my deployment schedule, she said quietly. She says it's so she can plan family visits, but something about it feels off. She's never been that organized before, and she's asking for really specific details. Trust your instincts, I told her. And document everything. Every conversation, every request, every detail she's asking for. If it feels wrong, it probably is. 6 months later, that documentation helped uncover another family-based intelligence operation. The sergeant's mother had been recruited through social media, targeted by operatives who'd identified military families through public posts and gradual relationship building. The pattern was evolving, but the core remained the same: vulnerable families, financial pressure, and the gradual erosion of boundaries around sensitive information. My story had become a cautionary tale, but also a survival guide. Other soldiers who'd faced family betrayal reached out regularly, looking for advice on navigating the impossible choice between loyalty and security. I'd learned to offer what I'd needed most in those early days: validation that their feelings were justified, practical advice for maintaining boundaries, and the assurance that choosing self-preservation over family demands wasn't selfish. The medal I'd received that day 5 years ago sat on my desk now, its meaning transformed by time and understanding. It no longer represented just survival in combat, but survival of betrayal, of manipulation, of the systematic destruction of trust by the people who should have protected it most fiercely. My family had stopped trying to contact me 2 years ago, their overtures gradually decreasing as it became clear that time wouldn't change my position. I heard about them occasionally through mutual acquaintances: Dad's continued unemployment, Mom's health problems, Mia's struggles as a single parent, Tristan's latest failed venture. The updates came with implicit questions about whether I'd reconsider, whether enough suffering had been endured to balance the scales. But there are no scales to balance when it comes to betrayal of this magnitude. No amount of consequence or remorse can resurrect the soldiers who died because my family sold intelligence to their killers. No punishment or apology can restore the trust that was shattered when I learned that my own blood had put a price on my life. The hardest part hadn't been cutting them off. It had been building something new in the space they'd occupied. Learning to trust colleagues who hadn't betrayed me, to accept support from people who didn't see me as a resource to be exploited, to believe that relationships could exist without transaction or manipulation. I'd found family among my fellow officers, bonds forged in mutual respect and shared purpose rather than accident of birth and financial dependency. These relationships were chosen rather than inherited, maintained through loyalty rather than obligation, strengthened by honesty rather than enabling. The ceremony 5 years ago had ended my old life and begun a new one. Not just because my family's betrayal had been exposed, but because I'd finally learned the difference between love and exploitation, between loyalty and weakness, between forgiveness and self-destruction. I still served. Still wore the uniform, still honored the values that had shaped me since enlistment. But I served now with full understanding that some threats come from within, that some betrayals cut deeper than enemy fire, and that survival sometimes means choosing yourself over the people who shaped you. The Purple Heart on my desk caught the afternoon light. Its purple ribbon faded from years, but its meaning crystal clear. I'd earned it not just by surviving enemy fire in Kandahar, but by surviving the discovery that my own family had loaded the guns pointed at me. That survival hadn't made me bitter or cynical. It had made me careful, selective about trust, protective of the boundaries that kept me safe. It had taught me that the family you choose can be stronger than the family you're born into, that loyalty is earned rather than inherited, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable the people who claim to love you. The general who'd revealed the truth that day had been right. My survival was extraordinary, not just because I'd lived through the ambush, but because I'd rebuilt myself after learning that the people I'd trusted most had orchestrated my near destruction. That rebuilding had taken years, but it had created something stronger than what had been broken. As I finished my paperwork and prepared to leave the office, I thought about the young sergeant who'd trusted her instincts and documented her mother's suspicious questions. She'd chosen security over family pressure, boundaries over blind loyalty, truth over comfortable lies. Her courage had prevented another tragedy, protected other soldiers from the kind of betrayal I'd survived. The cycle was broken, the pattern recognized, the threat neutralized before it could claim more lives. That was legacy enough for the girl who'd once believed family was everything, who'd learned that everything has limits, who'd survived to help others recognize those limits before it was too late. Outside, the sun was setting over the base, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold that matched the ribbon on my desk. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new soldiers to train, new threats to identify and counter. But tonight, I was simply a survivor who'd learned to thrive, a soldier who'd chosen service over blood, a woman who'd discovered that the strongest families are the ones we build ourselves. The knock on my apartment door came on a Tuesday evening in October, 6 years after the ceremony that had changed everything. I wasn't expecting anyone, and unexpected visitors had learned to make me cautious. Through the peephole, I saw a young woman with familiar dark hair and my father's stubborn chin, but older now, maybe 16 or 17. Emma. Mia's daughter, the toddler who'd been used as leverage in those early attempts at reconciliation. She stood alone on my doorstep, no Mia hovering behind her, no orchestrated family ambush. Just a teenager with a backpack slung over her shoulder and the kind of determined expression that reminded me painfully of myself at that age. I opened the door but kept the chain latched. Emma? Aunt Jenny. Her voice carried the careful formality of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. I know I'm not supposed to be here. Mom doesn't know I came. But I needed to talk to you. The smart thing would have been to close the door, to call Mia and arrange for someone to pick up her daughter, to maintain the boundaries that had kept me safe for years. Instead, I found myself studying this young woman who shared my genes but had been raised on blood money, looking for signs of the manipulation and moral flexibility that had defined my family. How did you find me? Google. Military records are public. Your promotions get announced in the local paper. She shifted her weight nervously. I've been following your career since I was old enough to use a computer. I know about the Purple Heart, about the promotions, about the speeches you give about operational security. What do you want, Emma? To understand. The words came out in a rush. To understand what really happened. Because the story I grew up with doesn't make sense anymore, and I need to know the truth. I stared at her through the crack in the door. This child who'd been weaponized against me years ago, now old enough to ask uncomfortable questions. She had Mia's features, but something in her eyes that reminded me of myself, a hunger for truth that wouldn't be satisfied with comfortable lies. Against every instinct I developed about family and trust, I unlatched the chain and stepped aside. You have 10 minutes. She entered my apartment with the careful attention of someone cataloging details, taking in the sparse military precision of my furnishings, the absence of family photos, the Purple Heart displayed in a simple frame on my desk. When her gaze lingered on the metal, I saw recognition flicker across her face. That's it, isn't it? The one from the ceremony Mom talks about. Your mother talks about the ceremony? Emma settled onto my couch without invitation, that teenage assumption of welcome that would have irritated me from anyone else. She talks about it all the time. How you cut the family off over a misunderstanding. How you chose the military over your own blood. How you broke Grandpa's heart and destroyed the family because you couldn't forgive one mistake. The familiar narrative, polished smooth by years of repetition. I'd expected nothing less. And you believed that story? For a while. Emma pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them in a gesture that was purely adolescent vulnerability. But then I started asking questions. Like why we moved 3 times when I was little. Why Grandpa never talks about his construction business anymore. Why Mom gets weird whenever anyone mentions the military or asks about you. I sat across from her, maintaining distance, but curious despite myself. What kind of questions? I found old bank statements in Mom's closet when I was helping her move last year. Deposits that didn't match her job history. Large amounts of money that started around the time you deployed to Afghanistan and stopped right after your ceremony. She pulled out her phone and showed me photographs of financial documents. 10,000 here, 15,000 there, always from something called Meridian Research Associates. The name meant nothing to me, but the pattern was unmistakable. The same systematic payments the investigation had uncovered years ago, documented now by a teenager who'd inherited more of my investigative instincts than I'd expected. I researched Meridian Research Associates, Emma continued. The company was dissolved 8 years ago, right around the time Mom says you abandoned the family. But before it was dissolved, it was under investigation by the FBI for being a front operation for foreign intelligence services. She'd done her homework. More thoroughly than I would have expected from someone raised by Mia, who'd always preferred comfortable lies to difficult truths. This girl had inherited something from my side of the gene pool, the compulsive need to understand, to dig deeper, to refuse easy answers. What do you think you've discovered? I asked carefully. I think my family sold information about you to people who tried to kill you. I think the money that paid for my childhood, my clothes, my school, my activities, came from betraying American soldiers. I think the reason you cut us off wasn't because you're cruel or unforgiving, but because we did something unforgivable. The words hung between us like a confession. This child, barely old enough to drive, had put together pieces her adult relatives had spent years trying to bury. She'd followed the evidence where it led, even when it led to truths that would shatter her understanding of her own family. Why does it matter? I asked. What's done is done. You can't change what happened. Because I'm about to turn 18. Because I've been accepted to college. Because every application asked about family military service, and I've been writing about my aunt the war hero, not knowing that my mother helped put her in danger. Emma's voice cracked slightly. Because I need to know who I really am before I decide who I want to become. The vulnerability in her voice reminded me painfully of myself at 18, desperate to understand my place in a family that had never quite made sense. But where I'd sought approval and belonging, Emma was seeking truth and accountability. The truth is complicated, I said finally. I can handle complicated. What I can't handle is lies. So I told her. Not everything. There were classified details I couldn't share, operational specifics that remained protected. But I told her about the ambush, about Jackson and Martinez and Crawford. I told her about the investigation, about the systematic intelligence gathering, about the money her family had collected for information that got soldiers killed. Emma listened without interruption, her face growing paler as the scope of the betrayal became clear. When I finished, she sat in silence for long minutes, processing what she'd learned. Mom always said you were the selfish one, she said finally. That you chose your career over family, that you were cold and unforgiving. But you were the one being betrayed. You were the victim. I survived. Others didn't. Because of information my family provided. She looked at the Purple Heart on my desk, understanding now what it really represented. God, no wonder you cut us off. No wonder you never wanted to see me. It wasn't about you specifically, I said, though that wasn't entirely true. She'd been part of the manipulation, used as leverage to try to guilt me back into compliance. You were a child. Children don't choose their parents or understand their parents' crimes. But I'm not a child anymore. Emma stood up, pacing to the window that looked out over the base. I'm old enough to understand what they did. Old enough to make my own choices about what kind of person I want to be. What kind of person do you want to be? She turned back to face me, and for the first time I saw not Mia's daughter or my father's granddaughter, but someone entirely her own. Someone who tells the truth. Someone who takes responsibility for their actions. Someone who doesn't sell out family for money. That's a good start. I want to enlist, she said suddenly. After college. I want to serve, like you do. I want to do something that matters, something that helps people instead of hurting them. The declaration shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. This girl, raised on blood money by people who'd betrayed everything the military stood for, wanted to serve her country. Wanted to honor the institution her family had damaged. Military service isn't penance, I told her. You don't owe anyone your service because of what your family did. Maybe not. But I owe myself the chance to be better than they were. To be someone you could be proud of. The words hit harder than I'd expected. For 6 years, I'd written off Emma as collateral damage, another casualty of my family's betrayal. I'd never considered that she might grow up to question what she'd been taught, to seek truth over comfort, to choose service over selfishness. Your mother's going to be furious when she finds out you came here. Let her be furious. I'm tired of protecting her feelings by staying ignorant about the truth. Emma gathered her backpack, preparing to leave. Can I ask you something? Do you think people can be better than their families? Do you think we can overcome what we come from? I thought about my own journey, about the years of therapy and boundary setting and learning to trust again. About the family I'd built among fellow service members, bonds stronger than blood because they were chosen rather than inherited. I think we become who we choose to become, I said. Family shapes us, but it doesn't have to define us. You can honor the good parts of what you inherited and reject the rest. What were the good parts for you? It was a question I'd never expected to consider. For years, I'd focused on the betrayal, the manipulation, the systematic destruction of trust. But Emma's presence forced me to remember that not everything about my upbringing had been toxic. Resilience, I said finally. The ability to survive difficult circumstances. Independence. The capacity to work hard for what you want. Those things served me well, even if they came from an imperfect source. Emma nodded as if this made sense to her. I got those things too. Along with the ability to ask uncomfortable questions and refuse convenient lies. Those are valuable gifts. I hope so. She paused at the door. Would it be okay if I wrote to you sometimes? Not asking for anything, not trying to reconcile the family. Just letting you know how I'm doing. Proving that not all of us turned out like them. The request should have triggered every alarm I developed about family manipulation. But looking at this young woman who'd risked her mother's anger to seek truth, who'd independently uncovered evidence of crimes her family had spent years denying, who wanted to serve others rather than exploit them, I found myself nodding. You can write. I can't promise I'll always write back, but I'll read what you send. That's fair. Emma hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, I think what you did took courage. Not just surviving the ambush, but surviving the betrayal. Setting boundaries. Choosing truth over family loyalty." After she left, I sat for a long time looking at the Purple Heart on my desk. For 6 years, it had represented survival despite betrayal, resilience in the face of family destruction. But Emma's visit had added a new dimension to its meaning. Perhaps the most profound victory wasn't just surviving what my family had done, but inspiring someone from the next generation to choose a different path. Emma could have been raised to see me as the villain, to blame me for the family's dissolution, to continue the cycle of manipulation and self-deception. Instead, she'd chosen truth. Chosen service. Chosen to be better than the people who'd raised her. That was legacy worth more than any medal. Thanks for staying with me. If this hit home, tap like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It helps more people find stories about boundaries, truth, and rebuilding after betrayal. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been dismissed or undermined by family at your biggest moment? Where's your line between forgiveness and self-protection? If you've served or love someone who has, how do you handle OPSEC with curious relatives? What would you have done the moment the general opened that file? What's one boundary you set that changed everything? Share where you're watching from, and if you want more true stories like this, follow for the next chapter.